Hello everyone, and welcome to on a very blustery and wintry Sydney night. My name's Ben Ralston. I'm the country manager for Audible Australia, and I'm very pleased to offer you a warm welcome tonight, and I know you're going to love it. So we're very proud at Audible of how we support the creator community, how we amplify their voices, and I'm especially proud to welcome Adam Liaw to the stage tonight. He's going to talk us through his Audible original, How Taste Changed the World. Adam, I'm sure he doesn't need a huge introduction, but a media personality, lawyer, father, of course chef, and now author with his Audible original, How Taste Changed the World. So tonight we're going to hear about how the five tastes shaped our planet, our food, and our history. Sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. So enjoy tonight. Adam will have Q&A at the end of the night, so please hold on to your questions. We're going to have video and photographers in the room tonight for our social, so please be aware of them. But without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Adam and give you a little taster, excuse the pun, of what you're going to hear tonight. So enjoy the night and welcome. Thank you.
So Adams, this Audible original podcast about the five tastes. I'm the main character, right? Salt did start the global economy, but we have more bitter taste receptors than any other. Well, sugar was so precious people could only buy a teaspoon a year. Sour is essential for survival. Our bodies don't even make vitamin C. Umami is the key to cooking. But shouldn't taste work together, Adams? How Taste Changed the World with me, Adam Liaw. Listen now, only on Audible.
Hello, everyone. I just want to make something very clear at the beginning. I am no actor. And if a PR agency comes to you with an idea for a TV commercial, think about how much changing you're going to have to do when you're filming that commercial. There's a lot of changing, a lot of different outfits for that. One other thing I want to make clear at the very beginning, and this is kind of the basis for the entire podcast here, is that we taste five things. Only five. Salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. Now, I understand that some of you are there thinking, hang on a second, I can taste broccoli, and I can taste cauliflower, and I can taste prosciutto. The problem with that is, our language in English, colloquially, what we call taste is often not what a scientist would call taste. If you wanted to define taste, a scientist might say it is the sensation that is generated or stimulated by the interaction of a taste bud in the oral cavity that triggers or stimulates a taste center in the brain. That's kind of the long-winded answer. But what we call taste, or sometimes flavour, is actually a combination of a lot of different things. It's taste, for sure. It's aroma. It's texture. It's sometimes pain. It's chemical irritation. All of these things combine to form what our idea is of taste, but it's not. Like, that's probably more appropriately called flavour. What we call taste is very, very simple. Five things, because we only have five taste receptors that we know of currently. There may be a few more. We explore that in the podcast a little bit, but we have five taste receptors: salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. So you've all got some jelly beans on your chair. We'll talk about those in a second, but actually, let's talk about them now while we're here. So I want to illustrate a little bit about the difference between taste and, say, aroma and how that combines to flavour. So open up the jelly beans first, close your eyes, pinch your nose, and take out a jelly bean. Without looking at it, you can look at it if you want to, I'm not fastidious about this. And with your nose still pinched, put it in your mouth and start eating it. What you should be able to taste is the sweetness of a jelly bean. You probably don't know what flavour it is. You probably don't know, unless you looked at it, what colour it is. Now let go of your nose and let the aroma of that jelly bean come through. It's a very different thing. So what should also be clear is that between taste and aroma, the one that's more important is taste. You can eat every one of those jelly beans in the box there and you're going to enjoy them all. except for the licorice ones. But the aroma that you get from it is kind of an addition to the taste. But what defines whether something tastes good or not is the taste of it. It sounds a bit trite to say, but taste matters for how something tastes. Aroma doesn't matter for how something tastes. You can go to an ice cream shop and there's 500 flavors there. You can put 3 different ones on a cone and you'll still enjoy eating that cone. It's not like you have 2 combinations of ice cream that go together and it's all of a sudden terrible and you don't like the ice cream anymore. So the reason that I think this is important, and then the reason that I'm kind of a little baffled that not many people talk about it, is that this is fundamental to cooking. This is how we make food taste good. Not by looking at the aroma, not by looking at the smell of it, by looking at the taste of it, or experiencing the taste of it. If you have something like coriander, you can put a teaspoon of coriander into a dish or a tablespoon of coriander into a dish. What that's going to do is make it smell more or less like coriander. If you have a teaspoon of salt or a kilogram of salt and you put that into a dish, that's the difference between it being good, and tasting terrible. Now, yes, we can smell a whole range of different things. You can smell the person next to you. You can smell the auditory. But the things that are important for how we experience, like the hierarchy of what's important to our senses, in that hierarchy, taste is right at the top. So how did we end up with 5 tastes? This is an evolutionary question. Sorry to any creationists in the audience here, but this is an evolutionary question. Why did salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami end up being the ones that are most important to us, and therefore most important to our cooking? Well, they each have an evolutionary function, a biological function. You have salt. Every life form crawled out of a primordial soup that was primarily sodium-based, and so every single animal and every single plant on Earth needs sodium, needs salt in order to survive, in varying quantities, obviously. If you look at sweetness, well, you could look at sourness as well. Salt and sour are actually ion channels. They're not traditional receptors. I apologise. You've come to a university, so you're getting a bit of a biology lesson here at the same time. But before I was a cook or a lawyer, I was actually a scientist studying biology, so you're going to get a little bit of that here. Apologies. You did come to a university, though. Salt and sour are actually ion channels. They are not a traditional receptor where you have a receptor and then a substrate comes into it and it binds and it creates a reaction of sorts. So salt, sodium chloride, or potassium and chloride, or whatever it happens to be, there's lots of different types of salt. Sodium and chloride tends to be the one that we are mostly concerned with in what we eat. And sourness, which is essentially a taste that allows us to detect acids, are very closely related. Sourness is actually very important, but I'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about sweetness. So sweetness is essentially, it tells our body that we're getting calories. So let's hear from one of our interviewees for the podcast, Dr. Stephen Munger. He's a professor at the University of Florida, looking at taste and smell. So here's what he has to say about sweetness.
Carbohydrates are a great source of quick energy. I mean, athletes know this, the carbo load is easily broken down to simple sugars that your cells can use metabolically to help you survive. And if you were to go back in time before grocery stores, before agriculture, before food was readily available, and you are on the savannah or wherever you are, and you're looking for food and you want to get something that's going to give you nutrients, energy, as quickly as possible and as densely as possible before that lion that may be stalking you can find you. Finding something that is really sweet would indicate that there's a lot of carbohydrate and it's probably worth your time.
I should point out that lion has no taste for sweetness because we aren't sweet. Lions eat us, so it doesn't need to appreciate sweetness. Lions and cats have no taste for sweetness at all, so don't go giving those jelly beans to your cat when you get home. For us, however, we evolved from apes, essentially. We are, as Josh Martin, who I can see in the audience there, who wrote the podcast together with me, we're fond of referring to one quote from the podcast saying that we are the one ape that left the forest. We are essentially apes, and what we evolved to eat was fruit. So our defining taste in the food that we like is actually sweetness and sourness. If we'd evolved from mice, for example, we'd taste carbohydrates, long-chain carbohydrates like starches. So to a mouse, a piece of grain tastes as delicious as an apple to us. And so this combination of sweet and sour, which you find in every cuisine throughout the world, is probably the most important to us because it helps us to identify energy, and energy is what all animals need to survive. Bitterness is a fascinating taste because we have more bitter taste receptors, as I said, as one of me said in the commercial, because there are a huge number of bitter things that we can experience, more so than salt. Like salt is pretty simple, sweetness is pretty simple, sucrose, glucose, fructose. There's a pretty small number of sugars that we taste. But when it comes to bitter compounds, there are thousands, and we have thousands of different bitter taste receptors. And they're actually different genetically as well, depending on where, I guess, the stock you came from. You would have to have evolved different bitter taste receptors for the plants that were in your immediate vicinity, wherever your family came from originally. Umami is interesting. Who's heard of umami before? Can I get a show of hands? That's pretty good. I guess you're here, right? So umami is fascinating to me. And to me, it is the most important for cooking because it is quite literally the taste of cooking. We'll talk about umami a little bit down the track. But umami is essentially we talk about bitter compounds reacting with our taste buds. Umami taste buds, which were very, very recent. If you don't know what umami is, do not feel bad. We identified the taste buds for umami in 2002, so we do not need to be entirely across it. There have been different constructions of umami throughout the years, but 2002 was when we finally can say that's the taste bud that umami is responsible for. And so umami reacts with amino acids and nucleotides, things like glutamate, as you would know from monosodium glutamate, aspartate, guanylate, inosine. These kind of amino acids, nucleotides that are present in the proteins that we form in our bodies. That is what gives us that umami taste. But the thing that makes it really interesting is how we increase that umami taste, why we need it. You know, you could say that does a lion have a strong taste for umami because it eats a lot of protein, it eats a lot of meat? Well, no, actually we have a stronger taste for umami than lions do. We'll talk about that in a bit. But let's jump forward a touch and hear from this guy, Liaw Modalingi. I'm sure you're all familiar with him because as we jump into the kitchen, as we work out how taste is relevant to us, one thing that's really important is how we address it in how we cook. So this is what we call the flavoring is, I guess, the adjustment of the flavors we use. The ingredients you choose will define the flavor of your dish, the aroma of your dish. The taste of your dish is defined by what we call seasoning. So this is what Yotam has to say about seasoning.
We know that in different parts of the world, there's different approaches to seasoning. For example, in Morocco, you sit to a meal and you get salt and cumin, not salt and pepper as we're used to in the West. And then, you go to Asia, and there's all sorts of condiments from a chili sauce or chili oil to maybe something a bit fishy, like a fish sauce kind of thing. And then those are what they call seasoning.
At home, if you go to your stove, what's on the left of it or the right of it? If you go to mine, there'll be salt, sugar, soy sauce, a couple of different types of wine, maybe a bottle of vinegar. How do you season at home?
The kitchen's just behind me, so there's olive oil, a big bottle of olive oil that it seems like to kind of almost empty itself every other day, although it's very big. I don't know how we use these quantities of oil, but we do. There's cider vinegar, salt and pepper, but my spice cabinet is just underneath the stove, and there's a whole load of spices. And I think, I can start naming them, but there will be just too much to name. There's cumin, cardamom, coriander, cinnamon, allspice. But then, there'll be a bunch of dried chilies there in flake form. I would use those kind of intermittently.
That's Liaw Modalingi's kitchen. An enviable place to be, I'm sure you'll imagine. But this is why I love audio. You get essentially this experience of somebody talking to you. This is the first podcast that I've produced and made, and I've kind of fallen in love with it as a medium. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think any of us that do listen to it, we realize just how much more intimate it is when you're watching something on TV. And I'm not against TV, I make a lot of TV shows. But there's something personal, and every word that you say in the audio sphere comes across, and you can listen to every word. You can watch something on TV and you don't know what the last 5 sentences were even about, but you listen to something and you're really deep in the moment of it. You feel like you're in Modalingi's kitchen. But let's go through then kind of the things that he uses in his kitchen. He's got obviously salt, cider vinegar, pepper. These are primarily taste. Sugar he mentioned as well. So you've got cider vinegar providing sourness, sugar for sweetness, salt for saltiness. Pepper's an interesting one because it is kind of two things. You get bitterness from pepper. If you pinch your nose and eat pepper, you'll get an awful lot of bitterness from it. But you also get chemical irritation. And chemical irritation and bitterness are very, very closely related. So we talk about kind of the two similarly. The other thing he talks about is olive oil. And olive oil we kind of think as being quite neutral, but if you look at cooking oils throughout history, it's only very recently that they have been neutral. Historically, things like mustard oil, rapeseed, which is now canola, olive oil are strongly pungent, strongly irritating, strongly bitter, and we add them to our food for that bitterness. The spices that he mentions are aromas. I'm not saying that aroma is not necessary for food or not desirable for food, but I'm just saying that if you had that hierarchy of what's important and what is less important, taste is fundamentally more important, biologically more important. We taste things for a reason. We smell things for another reason. But the thing that's going to make your food taste good or less good is how you season, how you adjust taste. And so Yotam also talks about, I guess, how taste differs around the world. We have salt and pepper on our tables, but in Morocco they have salt and cumin. You go to Asia, and I may be biased in this, but I find that the seasonings that you get that are sitting on the table for you to adjust the taste of your food, things like fish sauce, things like sugar, things like limes, those are the things that the more adjustment that you have to those 5 tastes, the limes are going to be there. The vinegar, like if you go to the Philippines or anywhere through Southeast Asia, you'll have lots of vinegars and citruses and things that you can use to adjust the sourness of your food. You obviously have fish sauce, saltiness that you can adjust to your food, and also, of course, umami that is in fish sauce as well. You'll have sugar on the table so you can adjust the seasoning of that as well. To me, that's a more complete way of seasoning. That's how I season when I'm cooking. It's also a very interesting way to think about seasoning once it gets to the table. So, as we season our food, when my grandmother taught me to cook and taught me to taste, it was really, she didn't eat beef, and so she would make spaghetti bolognese, for example, and she'd put a spoon to it and say, have a taste of this. And I'm just like, what am I supposed to be tasting for? It tastes good, it tastes bad. What is that? It's like, she'd just say, does it need more sugar? Does it need more salt? And she'd always talk about the taste of it. And that's what she would adjust. You don't get to the end of cooking a spaghetti bolognese and go, oh, you know what, I'm going to throw in an extra tin of tomatoes or something like that. You may do, but it's it's not that it doesn't taste tomatoey enough, it's that it's not salty enough or not savoury enough, or maybe a little bit too sour from the tomato, so it needs a pinch of sugar to adjust that. Once you understand that when you are seasoning food, you're adjusting just 5 things, it becomes really, really easy. Cooking becomes phenomenally easy when you think about it in terms of taste. It also kind of illustrates what I like to call the not tastes. Not tastes are things like chili. I throughout the whole process of making the podcast, I was calling it the chili problem. What do we do about chili? Chili is not a taste. We don't taste chili. Chili is a chemical irritant in the same way that olive oil has bitterness to it, but it also has chemical irritation. It irritates your throat as you do it. And I was like, why do we like this? Why is it important to us to have chili? Because chili did not exist around the world for a long time until Columbus went to the Americas and brought chili back from Mexico to the rest of the world. Imagine, Indian food without chili, but it was like that for most of the history of India. Citronese food didn't have chili until the 15th, 16th century. But there were other forms of irritation, things like pepper, things like mustard, things like those pungent oils that create that chemical irritation in your mouth. And they are very important. You ask a taste scientist about it, and it's kind of a cool response. It's like a roller coaster. We get excited by it. We get excited by the idea of eating something that is maybe a little bit dangerous. It's got that element of danger to it because biologically, this kind of could kill us, but we know that it's not going to. You wouldn't go on a roller coaster if you thought you were going to die, right? But it's that tension between doing something exciting but also knowing that you're safe that makes chili quite exciting to us. And that's not just because we're thrill seekers. We're thrill seekers also by evolution because as omnivores, we want to try new things. We get pleasure from trying new things. And we get pleasure from taking risks because if we didn't take those risks, we wouldn't evolve into the people that we are today. So that's, there is so much that's fascinating about this, so much that's fascinating about looking at how taste kind of defines the human condition. It's really cool when you get into it. The other non-taste that I think is really important is astringency. If you look at astringency, we talk about astringency in terms of tannins in wines, and it's kind of important, but not to taste, it's important to texture. Astringency is essentially sometimes we describe it as a dry characteristic in the mouth. If you have a wine with a lot of skin contact, the tannins from the skin will go into the wine, and then you'll get kind of like a dry taste of the wine. So that's why we like things like red wine and steak, because astringency balances actually with another texture that we experience in food, which is fattiness. So if you have a nice, rich steak, it doesn't have to be a fatty steak, it just has to be rich, because then you produce lubrication in your mouth. This is a little bit weird, but as we eat something that is strongly savory, strongly umami, we produce more saliva in response to that. What that saliva does, it lubricates our mouth, and we think this tastes delicious because you have the umami taste, but you also get that nice lubrication in the mouth. If the steak's fatty, you get extra lubrication. But then what you would like is to keep that lubrication in balance. So you have a nice tannic red wine, and it refreshes that. So we're talking about protein interactions here. The lubrication that you get is from two different proteins in your saliva, and then the tannins from the wine kind of neutralize those proteins. And you see that tension between savory or fatty foods and astringent things, whether it could be, pickles. Pickles are astringent. Quite often, if you look at pickling through history, there's a lot of things that are pickled using leaves or the skins, which is where the astringency is. And so you have fatty foods with pickles, and you have cheese in pickles and cheese in wine, or yum cha in tea. The tannins from tea will refresh the mouth there. You go to McDonald's, you have a Happy Meal, and you have French fries, and then you have cola. Cola was made from the cola nut, which is a tannic, astringent nut from West Africa. So all of these interactions actually have a really biological basis to them and explain so much about the food that we eat. So how did this change the world? So, you know how, I don't know if anyone studied geology or something, you have a molecule, the shape of a molecule that becomes a crystal. And then when that crystal grows large, it kind of resembles the shape of it, and that's kind of how our society works. Taste is phenomenally important to us, and therefore it has become phenomenally important to the societies that we have created. So let's go to salt. This is Antonia Finane, and this is another thing I love about audio, because Antonia has the most amazing voice for podcasts. Let's listen to her talk about a guy called Li Bing.
So Li Bing was a general official who was sent by the king who was the father of the first emperor of China, who was sent by him. So this is part of the expansion of the Qin state, and Li Bing was an agent in that expansion. He was sent to Sichuan, overlooked the conquest there, and in the course of hydraulic works, he is said to have discovered salt wells in Sichuan.
So salt is important to us because we have a taste for it, but it's also important for another reason. Salt kills things. It kills bacteria that would otherwise cause food to spoil. And so as we developed agriculture, the ability to access salt was kind of fundamental to creating an economic system, because it meant that food that you brought out of the ground or an animal that you killed didn't have to be eaten that day or the next day or put into a refrigerator that didn't exist. What you could do is, if you had access to salt, is you could cure that, you could preserve that, you could use it to pickle something, and then that food that you pulled out of the ground or killed could become a commodity, and you could sell that to someone in the next village or send it around the world. And so salt, before electricity, before refrigeration, was fundamental. We're talking about Li Bing, who was a general official in China around the Sichuan area. And he was kind of like, Da Vinci-esque in his scientific knowledge for the time. He was charged with, China has historically had a lot of problems with floods, actually still today. And he was charged with, solving that problem. And through the process of those hydraulic works, he discovered these salt wells. But he also discovered something that was a lot more interesting. Well, maybe not at the time, but a lot more interesting to us today. So salt can be brought from brine deep underground up to the surface. Salt, China introduced around this time, about 50 years before Li Bing, a salt monopoly. And that salt monopoly meant that it was essentially a consumption tax. Any salt that was used or bought or sold kind of had a GST attached to it. So that you then, and it was considered a more fair tax instead of, I don't want to get into a discussion of taxation. We've already done the science, let's not talk about tax, let's not make this the most boring lecture you've ever been to. But what it meant was that the Chinese economy was essentially driven on salt. It raised about 1/3 of economic revenue, and that salt monopoly persisted until 2017. So it's been around for 2,000 years, ended very, very recently. But what happened, Li Bing, he developed a method for drilling so that he could extract this brine from under the ground, which then had to be boiled and then turned into salt that could then be taken away. The way they did this was they took huge pottery jars, filled them with brine, lit a fire under them, chopped down some trees, lit that fire, and just kept boiling them until those jars filled with salt. Then they smashed the jars and took the salt and carried them away. That's how they used to do it. What they found was that people were dying when they were doing this. People that were digging the holes were being killed. And then he worked out that what was killing them was actually gas, natural gas. Li Bing discovered natural gas in China, and then what he also did was developed a series of pipes that could then, instead of having to go and chop down the tree and bring the firewood and boil, he created this system where you could extract the brine, put it into the jar, create a natural gas fire underneath it, and use this system to essentially print money. You know, salt was so valuable at this time, it was just this phenomenal money-making scheme that kind of drove the Chinese economy until electricity, frankly. I was going to talk about the Celts as well, but I think we should move on. But essentially, like we all talk about the Roman Empire, and as it turns out, I am talking about the Celts. We talk about the Roman Empire and the idea of a salary, a salarium, the salt allowance that was paid to Roman soldiers. But actually, fundamentally, most of the Roman salt technology came from the Celtic Empire, which was this phenomenally large empire that stretched from Ireland all the way to China, across the top of northern Europe. And they were defeated by the Romans at a very cool battle called the Battle of Alesia, where it was quite literally Vercingetorix, the leader of the Celtic resistance to Roman rule, fighting against, Brutus, Caesar, Mark Antony. It's like, they probably made a movie out of it or a podcast, but they certainly should. And they were defeated, and then all of this Celtic salt technology was kind of absorbed into the Roman Empire. So what we now think of as prosciutto actually came from the Celts, who used to cure hams centuries before the Romans ever did. And that prosciutto then went with the Roman Empire to England, became leg ham, and that's why we all have ham sandwiches with our lunch. So let's move on from the Celts to sweet and sour, because I think sweet and sour is the most important taste combination. We are the one ape that left the forest, and if you look everywhere, you've got sweet and sour pork, but you've got agrodolce in Italy, you've got that combination of sweetness and sourness in literally every cuisine. If you look in your fridge, you've got mustard. There's some bitterness there from the mustard, of course, but primarily the mustards that we eat are a condiment that is now sweet and sour. A lot of the pickles that we eat, sweet and sour. Tomato sauce, yes, there's umami there as well, but again, sweet and sour. Sweet and sourness is fundamental to how we eat, and you see it everywhere. So let's talk about why that's the case.
Think of a beverage company that basically sells sugar water for a living. I'll pick on the two largest beverage manufacturers on earth, which is the Coca-Cola company and the Pepsi-Cola company. Really what drives consumption of their beverages is the sweetness. It's the fact that there's sugar there, or when there isn't sugar there, there's sweeteners there. But despite that, they put acids in there. Their beverages aren't just sweet, their beverages are sweet and sour. In fact, there's so much acid there that the pH of their beverages is quite low. And so really, I think what they're doing is almost sort of mimicking, in some sense, fruit juice. They're making something that's sweet and sour. So it's a really interesting question is, why would we want that sweet and sour when we could just as easily have sweet alone without the sour? And I think there's something about the sourness there that makes it more desirable. It makes it more like it's a real fruit for us. We need to find sources of vitamin C and eat them or we'll die, because you can't live without vitamin C.
There's something quite humbling about realizing you're just an ape. And so who's got kids here? Little raise their hands. Kids never go into the kitchen and ask for a spoonful of sugar. They never do it. They ask for other things. They ask for lollies and candies. And actually, if you take a look at the bottom, I only just saw this before. If you look at the bottom of those jelly beans, you notice one of the key ingredients in there, just after the modified starch, is citric acid. Because we like sour. We think of sour as bad. All of the idioms around sour, like things leaving a sour taste in your mouth, they're all negative. But we like the taste of sour, particularly when you combine it with sweet. And that's because evolutionary, we like the taste of fruit. We evolved to like the taste of fruit. And it's become so important to us that we look for it everywhere. You know, soft drinks, they're not sweet. They're sweet and sour. Candy is not sweet. It's all sweet and sour. You know, we provide this taste of sweet and sour to make things taste good to us. And a lot of that has to do with vitamin C, because we don't produce vitamin C. We are one of very, very, very few animals in the entire world that do not produce vitamin C. The others are fruit bats, a couple of other species of monkeys and apes, and guinea pigs. All kind of fruit-eating animals that somewhere along the line, there was a mutation in the gene that we all have that is supposed to produce vitamin C, and it stopped producing vitamin C. Normally that would kill us, but because we were eating so much fruit, we just kept going and we didn't miss it, you know? So now we end up with this ridiculous situation where we don't longer live in the jungles that we evolved to live in, but we also can't produce our own vitamin C, so we have to find it everywhere. So we have this very, very important taste to us of sweetness and sourness, essentially to lead us to both calories from the sweet and vitamins and acids from the sour. And that's really, really important for how, I guess, we construct cuisine. Because if you look at every cuisine around the world, you will find sources of sweet and sour. You look in your fridge, you will find sources of sweet and sour. Let's move on to bitter. Because bitter's cool. Like, bitter's a cool taste. And it's cool because we shouldn't like it, but we do. You know, like, if you think about bitter foods that, again, every idiom around bitter is negative, but we all woke up and had a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. We love chocolate. We like beer. All of these things that we like are bitter, and we like them probably more than things that are sweet. And yet we think of bitterness as negative. So let's hear from Dr. Stephen Munger again around coffee.
How do you know when you go to your local coffee shop that the coffee that the barista hands you, the bitterness is due to caffeine and other perfectly fine chemicals associated with that coffee, as opposed to it being laced with strychnine? And you have a lot of clues. You went there yesterday and you're still alive. They're not people, you know, laying on the ground all around you that have been poisoned by this. You have the positive reinforcement of this being a ritual, of having the buzz of the caffeine, of having the time spent with friends, or whatever it is that gives you all these positive signals associated with bitterness in that context. But if you were to extract those bitter compounds and just have those alone without all of that other context, you would find them aversive or repulsive on their own. So that context is critical.
The context that we put around food is so important, not just because we want to like coffee. It's because, again, we are omnivores. The ability for us to eat a lot of different things is kind of fundamental to our survival. We want to eat a lot of different things. We want to be able to adapt to the environments that we live in, because we now live in every environment around the world. There's not many animals that can do that. We're the only one. And the ability for us to learn about food is extremely cool. And we see it most in terms of bitter foods. You know, nobody can pinpoint the exact moment that you started to like coffee. You didn't come out of the womb starting to like coffee. But somewhere along the line, this cumulative effect of all these positive signals around coffee. Maybe it started with the first time you saw your mum or dad have a cup of coffee, and yes, they didn't die. So, okay, yeah, coffee's not going to kill me. That's one hurdle over. But then you had a cup with friends. Then you had maybe a little bit of buzz from the caffeine. Then it became a social thing. Then all of a sudden, you like coffee, and you don't even know how it happened. And this is really useful. All the people that raised their hands earlier about having kids and not having them walk into the kitchen and ask for a spoonful of sugar. If you want to get your kids to like vegetables, you need to understand the science of this. Because kids are not supposed to like vegetables. Vegetables could kill them. Every vegetable is bitter. And so they are genetically, biologically programmed to want to avoid those things until they're big enough to not be killed by a potato. But when you know this, it becomes very, very simple. And yet we go the exact opposite route. You know, if a kid doesn't want to eat their broccoli, you say, sit there until you've finished it. And we create a negative experience around it, whereas we should be doing the exact opposite. If you want to get your kids to like vegetables, do the same thing as you would with coffee. Just start eating vegetables yourself so they can see that it's not going to kill you. And then, if they don't want to eat it, that's fine, eat something else. And then they'll have a positive experience around it. And that is quite literally, scientifically, the way that your kids are going to like vegetables. That's just how it works. Of course, there are other things you can do in terms of how you cook it and things like that help. Like, I talked about umami a little bit before, and actually I should jump onto that because we have like 10 minutes left, and I've got a lot happening. Let's talk about umami. So I mentioned it before, and if you've watched any of my TV shows or literally ever met me, you've probably heard me talk about umami because it is the taste of cooking. And I don't mean to say that in like, it's the essence of flavor or anything like that. It is in the same way that we evolved to like all these other tastes. We evolved a taste for umami because it is the taste of food manipulation. The things that we do, like you can eat a raw steak and it has all of those nucleotides and amino acids in it, but it doesn't have an umami taste. What we do to that steak is we might cure it or grill it. We don't boil it so much. Sometimes we do, but if we boil it, we sear the outside until it turns brown, because that turning it brown, the Maillard reactions, as we call them, gives it an increased umami taste. So we ferment things, we cure things, we cook things, and that's what produces the umami taste. And this is really important biologically to us, evolutionarily to us, because what it does is it makes food more bioavailable. All of those processes, fermentation, cooking, curing, is actually the start of digestion. So we actually start to do the digestion of those things, make the macronutrients more available, and then when we eat them, we get more benefit from them. Plus, it keeps them safe. All of those things ensure that food's not going to kill us. If you eat rancid meat, it can kill you, but if you grill it or cook it, it's going to be more safe for you to eat. If you ferment something, this is not a coincidence, the bacteria that we use for fermentation is the bacteria that populates our gut, and that fermentation process doesn't kill bacteria, it allows good bacteria to crowd out bad bacteria that could harm us. So it's like a no-brainer that we would evolve a taste for these things that are good for us and an aversion to things that are bad for us. There are very few animals that have a taste for umami in the same way that we do, and that's because we're kind of fragile. Like, we suck as animals. If you have a look at a baby, like, we are the most useless baby in the entire animal kingdom. Like, it takes like a year before you can even do anything. You can't feed yourself, you can't do anything. But thankfully, we have big brains, and that allows us to actually persist. But this taste of umami keeps us safe, and that's why we like it. So let's hear about Paul Breslin talk about umami, and specifically mother's milk.
The first life lesson we ever get on the road to gastronomy is actually mother's milk. It's interesting to me that human milk is unusually high in MSG. People who make baby formula want baby formula to be as close as possible to human milk as they can make it, but concerned moms and dads who buy formula for their kids don't want it to have a lot of these like nasty food additives in it that they think of as like bad guys in food for kids. Or you don't want a lot of added sugar, you don't want a lot of added salt, and you don't want a lot of added MSG. But the fact is that human breast milk is very high in sugar, salt, and MSG. So to make formula as human breast milk-like as possible, you'd have to add those things to it, and they don't want to because people would protest.
And when he's saying MSG, he means quite literally MSG. You know, the stuff, E621, whatever it is that we're terrified of. Because glutamate, the amino acid glutamate, is produced by every cell in your body. In your body right now, you have roughly 2 kilograms of free glutamate, which, if you just put a pinch of salt on yourself, becomes MSG. You know, that's sodium and glutamate is MSG, and it is everywhere. You know, it's become a very convenient thing for the food industry to hate MSG because you don't need to include it. But if you look at the back of every packet, you have things that are labeled differently. You know, hydrolyzed yeast protein, yeast extract, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, all of these things are free glutamate, free aspartate, free inosonate. And then as soon as you add salt to it, it's like, we didn't add any MSG, we just added salt and yeast, and then it created the MSG itself. You still get the MSG. The MSG still tastes great. And look, if anyone here is like, I react to MSG, I'm okay with that. You know, I'm not saying that you don't. I'm not saying it's a myth. I don't deal well with sugar. You know, like if I have a cake in the morning, by lunchtime I feel terrible. So I'm not saying that everything that is natural is good for you and everything is normal for you, but I'm just saying that in and of itself, MSG is not bad. It is in literally your boobs when you produce breast milk for your child. So, and I should say Paul Breslin cooks with MSG, as does every single taste scientist that I spoke to in the process of making this podcast. It is a very, very common thing. I cook with MSG. So I'm not going to get on a high horse about it, but it is the easiest way to make your food taste good, so just think about that. And you add it anyway. You add it when you add stock. Like you spend a lot of money on expensive stock when what you're doing is essentially adding MSG. So let's talk about that very, very briefly. I've got like 6 minutes left, so let's put this into practice, all right? This is food. This is literally, I never thought I'd be giving a presentation where it's just like stuff from my Instagram up on a screen. But let's talk through how these tastes affect the way I cook anyway. So you look at, this is lamb, some chili, some rosemary, and a bit of mustard. So what I do with the lamb is firstly, instead of boiling it, I throw it on barbecue. I just put salt in it and I put it on the barbecue. It produces that Maillard reaction. It turns it brown. As soon as it's brown, it tastes good. That's all that you need to know. Like that's why we sear stuff. That's why we put stuff on the barbecue. That's why that tastes good. That's not the whole story, however. You know, the chilies are there because like that roller coaster that the scientists talk about, it's interesting for us to eat chili. Like it's daring, so I put some chilies there with it. But then the mustard up the top there, it's not a complete meal without it because the mustard is what's providing a little bit more bitterness, plus that sweetness and sourness. Because when you produce mustard like that, it's, you know, you put vinegar with it, you put sugar with it, and you produce that. And so that's why that tastes good. You don't need to worry about, like the rosemary's not doing anything. There's no heavy lifting happening with the rosemary there. It's a very, very simple thing. This is nikudofu. It's a Japanese dish. Nikudofu just means meat and tofu. But if you look at the basis of Japanese cuisine, with about 5 seasonings, you can produce just about anything. You know, soy sauce, mirin, which is a sweet rice wine, sake, which is a dry rice wine, sugar, and then miso you can add on there as well, which is another source of umami. Most of those are sources of umami. Wine, the reason we cook with wine is that it is a source of umami. That's why it's there. It's a source of MSG, quite literally. And that's why we cook with it. If you take unfermented wine, grape juice, sorry to Maggie Beer, but verjuice, you know, if you boil something in verjuice, it's not going to taste great. You boil it in wine, it's going to be coq au vin. You know, that's the difference. And the only difference there is the umami, literally the MSG that is naturally occurring in that wine as it's fermented. So here you have essentially the seasonings that have gone into this: soy sauce, mirin, sugar, and sake, and that produces that dish. And the interesting thing about this is, like, so spices have gone around the world. The aroma of spices has gone around the world through the spice routes. You know, Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus were locked in this battle to find a route to Asia to bring spices back to Europe. And Christopher Columbus went the wrong way. He thought he was getting to India, but he went to the Americas instead. And he was so annoyed about it, he refused to believe it wasn't India. That's why they're called the West Indies. That's why Native Americans are called Indians. Like, he just said, look, this is India, clearly, obviously. And that's true. Like, I'm not just making that up. That's how that works. But in that period, Japan had what was called sakoku, a closed country, and it meant that while that other spice route kind of went everywhere else, they didn't go to Japan. So Japanese cuisine has hardly any spices. There's not much cumin or paprika or cinnamon in Japanese cuisine. It's just about the taste of it, and that's why it's kind of so simple and so easy to cook. That's why I cook Japanese cuisine quite a lot. I mean, the spice route went all through Southeast Asia, went all the way through India, went through Europe, went through the Americas, you know, and then you can find those spices everywhere. But Japan kind of stayed closeted off, and so there's not many spices there, and the cuisine doesn't suffer from it. I like spices just like as much as the next person, but what's important to cuisine is, I think you're getting the gist of now, is how it tastes. And so what Japanese cuisine has is this very clearly defined sense of seasoning. Sa, shi, su, se, so is the mnemonic for in Japanese. Sa is sato, sugar. Shi, shio, salt. Su, vinegar. Se is the original spelling of shoyu, soy sauce, and so is for miso. So those 5 seasonings are kind of seasoning to the 5 tastes, and that's how Japanese cuisine. That's what Japanese cuisine is based on. Risotto, I don't even know why I put this picture here, but no, it's just, I remember now. It's all about umami, right? Tomatoes, umami. Parmesan cheese, umami. Stock is the source of umami. If you actually look at stocks around the world, they all contain roughly the same concentrations of umami-rich molecules, and that concentration is around the same as breast milk. So there's a very clear biological connection to why we like these things. And then a stir fry, stir frying is very, very simple, because what you do is you fry something very quickly, you get a bit of browning on it, you add some kind of umami seasoning to it, whether it's oyster sauce in this case, or a bit of soy sauce, or a bit of rice wine, something that's fermented usually, or cured, or if you go to more traditional Chinese cuisine, they'd probably put a few slices of cured ham or something in there and just stir fry a vegetable with a few slices of cured ham, and that's where you're getting your source of umami from. Very, very simple. The other thing that you actually see a lot of is soup. In Japanese and Chinese and every East Asian cuisine, soup is there as a source of umami, because if you couldn't afford to have cured meat lying around sitting there for a long time, or you couldn't afford to, the fermented sauces, what you could always have is a bit of broth on the side, and that provides the same umami that you would get from, say, a cup of tea with yumcha, or a glass of wine, or a glass of sake. We add this umami beverage or a soup to a savory dish, and that increases the overall sensation of what we're experiencing. The last thing I want to finish off, almost just slightly over time, but we did okay, is kind of carbohydrates, because I feel like we talked about sugar, but we didn't talk about the thing that produces 73% of the calories we consume as a species is long-chain carbohydrates, starches. And why do we like them? That we shouldn't. We're not mice. We evolved from apes, not mice, so we don't have a taste for carbohydrates, long-chain carbohydrates. We have a taste for sugar, not long-chain carbohydrates. We don't eat rice and immediately think that is delicious. But let's hear from two scientists about it.
Your grandmother may not have made the best X, Y, or Z, but it was your grandmother. She made it for you. And that changes the way that you relate to that particular dish. The emotional and connectedness component of smell and taste is absolutely essential. Food and drink are not just sources of nutrients for us. They're sort of the hub of so much of our social lives. We may eat alone sometimes, but our meals with our families, holidays, going out with friends, having a drink after work, whatever it might be, it's part of a ritual of our lives.
Think about the concept of breaking bread with someone. What does it mean to break bread with someone? That there's this idea that you're bonding with someone, that you're sharing something with them that's creating a link between them. And we build community around food. It's a very deep, deep concept. And we bond socially over food. Taste and smell are how we create society.
This was really interesting to me, because I expect all the chefs that we talk to, or the historians that we talk to talk about, this context or this ritualization of food that we all experience. But it was the scientists who were talking about it. And that was kind of cool, because if you look, I grew up eating bowls of white rice. Some of us grow up eating bread or potatoes, and we love those things as we become adults. And just like we learn to like coffee or broccoli or all those other vegetables, we have good experiences with these, and that becomes so important with how we appreciate food. So if you think back to when you were a baby, just cast your mind back. But you probably grew up eating starches. You probably had a bowl of rice. And what do babies do? They drool a lot. In our saliva, we have an enzyme called amylase that breaks starch into sugar. So if you put a piece of bread in your mouth, a lot of people probably did this at school. You put a piece of bread in your mouth, you leave it there for 2 or 3 minutes, and all of a sudden it starts to taste sweet. That's, I wonder if pre-agriculture, the moving of the human diet towards starches and grains rather than fruits, I wonder if babies drooled as much as they did, because I don't think they would have. I don't have anyone to ask about that, but that's my theory. But what's more important than that conversion of starch to sugar and giving you a pleasant taste is that when a baby's hungry, if you look at a baby's face when it's crying because it's hungry, it's awful. It's the worst thing for a baby to be hungry. But then it eats something and it has a positive experience with it. And so as that bad experience goes away, you get positive reinforcement in the same way that you have positive reinforcement with like coffee or broccoli or vegetables or whatever it is. And it was that kind of humanization of love of food that I found, I don't know, I'm getting a bit emotional about it. But it was very cool to hear the scientists talk about that. And that was such a gratifying thing in the process of making the podcast. Hearing them kind of contextualize that was very interesting. Didn't mean to end this weirdly, but that's how it's gone, sadly.